You're listening to the Voice of Russia Daily Debate. And today we're discussing the fallout from this weekend's European elections on the three main parties here in Britain. I'm Howell Davis. It's the first time for 100 years that a national election has been won by a party that's not either the Conservatives or Labour. That's the scale of the political earthquake that struck Britain in the last few days. The UK Independence Party won 27.5% of the vote in the European elections, meaning it now has 24 MEPs. Labour, on 25.4%, narrowly beat the Conservatives into third place, while the Liberal Democrats lost all but one of their seats and came fifth behind the Greens. UKIP gained seats not just in traditional Conservative areas, but also in Scotland and Wales, proving that in European elections at least, that it's become a national party. UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, now says his party will target a dozen or more seats in next year's general election, hoping to gain influence in what promises to be a tight contest. So where does this week's election leave the established British parties? Will the Lib Dems be forced to turn to a new leader? How will Labour react to losing votes in its heartlands? And can the Conservatives persuade UKIP supporters to turn to them? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Mark Thompson, independent commentator and former Lib Dem, Richard D. North, a Conservative commentator and author of The Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything, and Sunny Hundal, political commentator and contributor to The Guardian newspaper. If I might turn to you, Mark, first down the line, the Lib Dems seem to be in all sorts of disarray, with lots of talk of defenestrating Nick Clegg.
Absolutely. I think they are in a bit of a mess at the moment, and there seems to be real uncertainty about what's going to happen. It's the first time I can remember there being this level of serious debate about whether Clegg is going to remain leader or not. In some ways, it's been quite remarkable for the first 3 or 4 years of this coalition that there's been so little talk about Clegg going. I mean, you get the usual noises off people like Lord Oakeshott, who would occasionally chip in. Just for the uninitiated, he's a big backer of Vince Cable, and although Vince tends to keep his own powder dry, there are certain outriders. But generally, the membership has been largely happy with what the party leadership has done, albeit there have been quite a lot of members who've left the party, and therefore you could argue that what you've had is the membership, the grassroots that are kind of left over, the people who are more likely to be loyal anyway. But I actually think we're now in a position where it's very difficult to call what's going to happen. There's been a petition put together by an organisation called Lib Dems for Change, and they seem to have several hundred signatures, mostly of party members, and there is now talk of local organisations having meetings to talk about the possibility of voting to get rid of Clegg, and there would need to be 75 local parties get together and do that in order to trigger a leadership election. So I think this is definitely the worst situation Clegg has been in, and it actually reminds me, I don't think it's a happy parallel to draw, but it reminds me of the kind of disarray that Labour was in with Gordon Brown in the final year of their time in office.
And do you actually expect Nick Clegg to have to go? I mean, there was a poll in The Guardian today talking about how the party would do better under Vince Cable, but with only a year to go, is it realistic to see Clegg going?
Well, that poll was very interesting because that poll was paid for by an anonymous Lib Dem member. And again, I don't recall anything like that having happened in the recent past. And actually what the poll shows is that really, even if Clegg was replaced, even with Cable, it would only make a marginal difference. So I'm not sure that poll has particularly made the case for getting rid of Clegg. I think ultimately it's unlikely Clegg will go because he doesn't want to go. I mean, he looked absolutely exhausted and actually quite emotional in interviews yesterday. But I think when he regroups, I don't think he will go voluntarily. And again, a bit like with Gordon Brown, if Clegg doesn't want to go, it is very, very difficult to get rid of him without there being massive internal bloodshed that would probably leave the party in an even worse position.
Sunny Hundal, speaking of leadership changes, lots of people saying that Miliband isn't getting his message across in a way that voters find appealing.
There's always going to be people saying Miliband isn't getting his message across. I mean, I think that it's difficult for him, given that the media is very much against him, that it's difficult to break out when you don't have any specific policies because we know that the election is a year away. And also, it's the kind of person that Ed Miliband is. He's very thoughtful, nuanced about things. He's not confrontational. He's not showy, flashy in a way that Tony Blair was. And it's so in the media environment that we're in, it makes it very difficult for him to stake out a position that grabs everyone's attention because, he's much more used to and comfortable with giving speeches and saying, this is what I feel intellectually and this is where we want to go. But of course, the media isn't interested in sort of policy discussion. So it ends up getting drowned out by other discussions or, headline-grabbing sort of announcements. And so it is difficult for him. I don't think it's impossible, but they are going to work on that over the next year. I think the problem that Labour faces isn't policy. It's the fact that they're not getting breakthrough in what their policies actually are.
But if they're not putting forward their policies yet, that's hard to get that breakthrough.
Yes and no. I mean, let's say even if you put fairly radical and sort of far-reaching policy forward, let's say, for example, on healthcare, they've said, they're going to integrate social care with healthcare, sort of normal healthcare. It is actually really far-reaching in the way they want to fundamentally change how healthcare is provided in this country. But of course, most people in this country don't know about it because the media didn't really go big on it. The BBC did barely cover some of the speeches that they've made because they're not interested in that policy detail. So, even if they were to announce an earthquake, and they have in many other areas, it'd be very difficult for them to sort of get that across to most people.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? If you elect an unaspiring orator as your leader, then, you're going to have problems getting a message across.
Yeah, sure, but you can't have it both ways. And during the days of Tony Blair, everyone's saying, we need someone who's thoughtful and we need someone who's intellectual because the party's sort of run by a guy who's a showy guy who likes gimmicks. He's much more of a narrator than he is sort of a doer and sort of thinker. And now that you've got that, everyone's like, oh no, we want Tony Blair again. So we've got a guy who's intellectually sort of confident. He knows where he's going. He knows what he wants to do and change the party. The problem, of course, is that he's not gifted in being the showman that Tony Blair was. And then, what can you do?
Richard, the Conservatives losing more votes than any other party to UKIP. Is that a worrying thing for you?
I would have thought the Tories are in fabulously good nick.
They've come third.
They've come third. It could have been far worse. I think when UKIP's real face is shown, after all, for the first time in history, we'll start taking, as the British people, an interest in the European Parliament. We won't like what we see, probably, and we won't probably like the way UKIP behaves within it, and we may quite like the way some Conservatives behave within it. So I could see all the ordinary logics for the wheels coming off the UKIP bandwagon to do with, vote UKIP, get the exact opposite of the leader you want in Downing Street, compounded with now we're going to look at the European Parliament and consider that the Tories are probably our best bet there, not least as Cameron applies pressure, and the pressure is presumably helped by the new bombshells. Labour looked to be in enormous difficulties, and I would have thought because, unlike Sunny, I can't see that Miliband is a convincing intellectual. I can't see that he's convincing in terms of having a large message. He's a little bit Occupy, if you know what I mean, a little bit anti-capitalist, a little bit all that when he feels like it. He can be a little bit Blue Labour, that intellectual strand of let's understand some economics, and let's socialise economics. That's all good. It's pretty weak. It's not strong, and he hasn't even made a very strong pitch on it. I don't think they're very strong on policy for all kinds of reasons, partly because nobody is. It's extremely difficult to be strong on policy at the moment. Nobody wants a big policy bombshell in welfare. People are trying to make big changes without having to make big changes, which is about the state of affairs.
So we're saying that we can't make big changes because we can't afford it, basically?
Well, we can't afford it, and we don't want big administrative disruptions. We've had enough of those. So, and the Tories delivered a surprise administrative disruption, and that'll do quite nicely for now, sort of thing. And the Lib Dems, poor loves, one's always tempted to be condescending towards them, which isn't quite right, but they were always a protest vote, so they were always looked rather larger than they actually were, partly because they were such a natural home for protest. Well, they've lost that role, but it was never a very good role for a political party. In all of that, you kind of think that the Tories might do quite well, except that they're disliked. The anti-posh thing is very powerful.
Indeed, and the latest Lord Ashcroft poll shows, because UKIP are leeching away their vote, is that Labour will get a majority of 80-odd MPs, according to the latest Ashcroft poll.
Well, I believe it when I see it. I mean, I wouldn't dream of calling the next election. I wouldn't dream of calling the Tory vote or the Labour vote, and I wouldn't dream of calling how the third or fourth party vote factors in to what then happens as we get a new government. I mean, I think politics is going to stay messy for a very long time, perhaps, for the foreseeable future, like several decades. I think it could stay messy. And whether or not it's messy within looking quite tidy, whether or not Tory and Labour manage to be sort of a two-party system, but so fractured amongst themselves that it's actually quite fractured, or whether they look quite coherent but they're surrounded by parties nipping at them. It's the same effect in the end of fracture and non-predictability.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the implications of the European elections on Britain's three main parties. I'm joined down the line by Mark Thompson. He's an independent commentator and expert on the Liberal Democrats. Richard D. North, a Conservative commentator and author of the Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything. And Sunny Hundal. He's a political commentator and contributor to the Guardian newspaper. Sunny.
There's something about the rise of UKIP that says about the intellectual problems that the Conservative Party faces, which is, UKIP appealed to older working class voters who feel marginalised in many ways, culturally as well as economically.
A lot of those are Labour supporters as well, of course.
Overwhelmingly more Conservative than Labour supporters, but yes, there is that too. But, what it says is two things. Firstly, a lot of that support now is coming in northern areas where UKIP are becoming the natural party of opposition. And that's very toxic for the Tories because, they were popular, in the days of Thatcher in the north, and they're not anymore. And so if working class voters prefer UKIP as the party of opposition to Labour, that says something very strongly about how toxic the Tory brand is. And secondly, it says something about why that brand is toxic. It's toxic because they feel that the Tory party has become so libertarian, so focused on big capitalism, that, they don't even feel that these people are looking out for their interests. And the Conservative Party has drifted away from looking after their interests, and speaking to them in a language that they understand. That's a serious problem for the Tories over the longer term.
Aren't the issues they're really worried about immigration and Europe, though?
No, I think it's more than that. It is very much, to me, a cultural thing too. It's economic. Like I said, it's not just immigration, because immigration is almost a proxy for other issues. They feel that the Conservative Party has become too modernised culturally, for example, in many ways. Even on
a metropolitan elite.
Exactly, right. But also, if you look at the polling, they also say that these people are run by rich, banker-friendly people who are not in the same world as them, who are not looking out for their interests. That's one of the biggest...
Sorry, Mark's trying to get in here.
I think there's a more fundamental thing going on here as well, which is that, one of the things that I've campaigned on for many years is electoral reform, and we saw a few years ago that when a change in the electoral system was put to the electorate, it would have been a fairly moderate change, to be fair, to change to AV, preferential voting. But what we're seeing is that we're seeing the rise of multi-party politics even without that change. Some people in the electoral reform movement used to think that, you would get the multi-parties rising once you got electoral reform, but we're seeing it happen the other way round. And there seems to be quite a lot of research I've seen that suggests that countries where they have changed the electoral system, it's happened that way. It's happened because the parties, there's become more and more parties and the votes have become split. And you've ended up with this kind of very unpredictable set of results in first past the post elections, because the major parties start getting less and less. They drop down to, 40, 35, 30% or even less. It is possible under the current system for, say, Labour to get maybe 31, 32% of the vote and still get a majority, especially if UKIP split the vote. But what's happening is that people, I think, are just fed up of hearing vote UKIP, get Miliband, or vote UKIP, get Cameron, or vote Clegg, get Cameron. People are just sick and tired of that. And what they've decided is, no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to vote for who I want to vote for. And, I don't care if you tell me that means someone else will get in. I've had enough of this. And I think that the rise of UKIP is underlining that problem. And it is also, I think the way that the main three parties have reacted to the rise of UKIP, it's been quite astonishing, really, to see the spokespeople after spokespeople come on the media and say, yes, we're listening and we're going to learn the lesson, and what we're going to do is, and then they reel off a big long list of things that they were going to do anyway. It's like they haven't understood the fundamental change. I mean, to borrow a phrase from John Prescott from a few years ago, the tectonic plates of British politics are changing fundamentally. And I don't think most people who voted for UKIP are racists or bigots. I just think they're sick of the main parties and the kind of elitist attitude that they have, and that they just don't engage in. They speak in this very strange, stilted style that is sort of trying to not really answer the question and get the message across they want to get across. People are just tired of it. And even though I think Farage is a fraud, he talks a good game, he stands there with his pint and his fag, and I think people like that. And I think they're really tired of the kind of machine politics that we've seen for far too long.
Richard?
There's something in all that, though. One does slightly wonder if your analysis is right, Mark, why the Lib Dems didn't do better this time. After all, some people must quite like what they offer, and they could have had that. And I slightly dispute the caricature, as it were, of Labour defection to UKIP in the north. I mean, if this was people worried about welfare, surely they could stick fairly comfortably with Labour. I worry about this business, and I think it's a rhetoric that I agree is powerful. An argument that I agree is powerful, and I want to get past it, and it's to do with this dislike of our political class.
So do you think European elections was basically a plague on all your houses?
I think it was all of that, but I also think that it's a very silly idea that we've got a bad political class. We have got a political class that is actually pretty good and getting better. And
how do you measure that?
I measure it by what I think is pretty good government and arguments conducted pretty intelligently.
But if the public don't believe it...
Yes, in this case, this is why, granted that democracy is a retail business and it doesn't pay to irritate the customer, I do think it's frightfully important to say two things. One is that the people who go around being disaffected by this country should consider how extraordinarily lucky they are to live in this country, governed the way it is, by the people it is. My generation, there's people who are grumpy. I think they should, as it were, grow up. I think they've had it very easy for a very, very long time. Some have had some big disappointments recently with pensions. I grant that would go very deep and be very, very embittering. But on the whole, we've had it pretty good. And we should be pleased with the world that is unfolding around us.
But for many people, they've just lived through the longest recession Britain's had in the last 100 years.
And most of them not been terribly badly bitten by it. I mean, recessions in this country, especially modern recessions, are nothing like a revisitation of the 30s. The welfare state did not collapse. It pinched, but it did not collapse.
Yes, but say, for example, food banks. The use of food banks rose enormously. That's not a good sign.
The evidence of food banks is quite peculiar, and it doesn't imply that people are rushed starving to the food banks. Now,
but Richard,
because we sitting in London as commentariat, we know rather little about what's out there, but I think what's out there is not half as awful as us worriers.
Well, what are you
make it
basing
out to
that
be.
on, Richard?
Well,
you're saying that we don't know enough about the world out there. But you're saying that you know more. But what is that based on?
Well, I watch a lot of television, and I notice that people.
Come on.
Sorry, I watch a lot of television. I watch Benefit Street. I watch soap operas.
Come on.
Really? That's your analysis of the country, you watch Benefit Street, and therefore you know what's going on in the country, really?
Yes, but the difficulty is that we haven't seen the government say, we're not going to allow welfare payments. We've seen people pinched, and it would be very, very unpleasant to be unemployed. But we came through this recession with remarkably less unemployment than we could ever have reasonably have expected. The idea that this...
Sorry, can I let Mark come in here, because he's down the line, so it's difficult.
Sure, no, absolutely.
Mark.
Well, I was just going to say, this attitude that Richard seems to be espousing of you've never had it so good, and kind of basing, his opinions on what he's seen on Benefit Street, which is, by admission of its producers, not necessarily representative of the real world out there. And unfortunately, the kind of things that he's espousing there are kind of reminiscent of the way I think the Tory party can be caricatured. Now, I don't think that's necessarily fair, because I actually think that quite a lot of what the government has done is well meant. I think some of the things like the bedroom tax and some of the other measures, I think, have been ill-conceived and have backfired and not worked out correctly. But I do believe that Ian Duncan Smith and other people within government genuinely have a desire to try and make things better for people, even though if the medicine that they might be prescribing isn't liked by a lot of people. But I just don't think that you're going to get very far by trying to claim that, everything's, so much better than the media is portraying. People out there are feeling the pain, and although employment is increasing and unemployment is going down, there are a lot of people who are on like 0-hour contracts and minimum wage, and you've got the whole problem of internships. And I mean, I'm really glad that I am of an older generation, because if I was coming out of university now, or even if I was coming out of school now, I'd be really worried about my future prospects, and they are prospects that stay with the generation for decades if they don't get the opportunity. So I think, frankly, it's a little bit complacent.
You're tuned to The Voice of Russia, and today we're discussing the implications of the European elections on Britain's three main parties. I'm joined down the line by Mark Thompson. He's an independent commentator and expert on the Liberal Democrats. Richard D. North, a Conservative commentator and author of the Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything. And Sunny Hundal. He's a political commentator and contributor to The Guardian newspaper. Richard.
I'm not being complacent, but I would like to point out, for instance, that UKIP is attracting a middle-aged vote going on an elderly vote who are on pensions which have not been touched. But the young, who you rightly worry about as having anxieties now and deep anxieties, are not, so far as we know, voting much. And insofar as they are, they're not voting UKIP. This bombshell that has gone off has not been a bombshell, so far as I've understood it, from those people who one could reasonably say are badly affected by our current economic upheaval. So that's true,
kind of,
but
that's partly because the central message of UKIP, which is focused on immigration, is just not interesting enough to the younger generation. The younger generation is much more comfortable with liberal Britain. It is pro-immigration. If you look at all the polls, you're right, actually, in that the older generation is much better off than the younger generation.
There is a sort of, you're saying there's a social unease they're feeling.
Yeah, there is unease.
Which would seem to indicate immigration as being one of the key issues then.
But that's the thing. The younger generation is not blaming the problem on immigration. The older generation is.
Exactly, and they're the people who are voting UKIP.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm saying is, yes, you should be right. Richard is right in saying those people should be voting UKIP, but the reason they're not is because UKIP blames it on immigration, whereas the younger generation is pro-immigration and is not blaming it on that.
No, forgive me. I think the younger generation should be voting.
First, they should be voting. Yeah.
Secondly, they should be voting Tory or Labour or Lib Dem or Green, because all of those, in their different ways, catch different elements of what I understand young people to be thinking. I mean, it happens to be extremely interesting at the moment that we read that about a third of young people, according to newish polls, are both liberal socially and liberal, by which I mean libertarian, economically.
Yeah,
in other words, they are the kind of people who the Tories have until quite recently rather despaired of ever finding. But they're there, and they're 30 years old, and they should be out there voting. Now, more than that, I think they are actually probably beginning to affect the parties, because they are the kind of people who are producing, as it were, political professionals, which is one of the reasons I'm not very worried about the political class. I think politics goes on attracting, at a professional level, quite interesting, energized people. I think the trouble is that the mass rhetoric of the country is, we're all fed up, all politicians are all the same, they're all awful, and there's no differences between them.
But do you not think that the fact that the politics is attracting people from a certain political class, basically a professionalized group of people who have spent all their years in politics, as opposed to the years coming from the communities which they seek to represent, means that these people are speaking in a way that does not address those people? Like, I sympathize with Mark.
You could sort out the political class issue by making it more attractive for people who had huge world economic experience into politics, which at the moment the media and others are doing their very best to make very unattractive. Or you can settle for what we've got, which is an over-professionalised political class, which I regret, but I can't see much alternative to it. So then I look at the quality of those people. Well, they can read and write, they're thoughtful, they're not extremist, they are
but
mildly
they're all the
ambitious.
same, isn't that why they alienate ordinary people?
You say they're all the same, I say...
They all go to sort of North London schools, or public schools, they go straight to big spads, and they go off and become an MP, and then blah, blah, blah.
They do, but some become libertarian Tories, and others become high taxation socialists. Now, I have no idea why, but they do, and it's a difference.
A very narrow class of people who all knew each other when they were growing up and all went to these, expensive public schools. I mean, I'm slightly caricaturing. They didn't all go that route, but a good proportion of people.
And a rising proportion.
Well, they went to expensive comprehensives, in the sense that you've got to be jolly rich to live in the neighbourhood of where you could go to one such.
So whether they paid for private education, or the parents did, or whether their parents could pay for the expensive houses to be near the better state schools, is almost irrelevant. The point is, it's a pretty narrow clique of people that you've got. You've only got to look at the leaders of the three main parties. At Westminster, actually,
well, even the four main parties, Mark.
UKIP is one of the main parties.
Yeah, exactly.
This is part of the problem, and this is part of why UKIP has risen so well, because that clique of people are not seen as in touch. Whether this is true or not, because a lot of them are MPs and have constituents and probably are more in touch than you might think. But when they come across on the media, in the articles they write, and the speeches that they make, they just don't connect with people.
But isn't that...
Sorry, can I move the argument on side here? Mark, can I put it to you that we haven't talked about Europe and how that's reflected in what the voters have done over the last few days. The Lib Dems, their leader, came out and debated on Europe with Nigel Farage, and it didn't seem to work at all. Do you think that all three main parties will now have to change their attitude towards Europe?
I mean, I don't think the Lib Dems will fundamentally change their attitude to Europe, because they are, as the campaign slogan I thought was ill-conceived at the time, a few weeks ago, the party of in. I mean, the Lib Dems are the party of in. Most Lib Dem members are pretty staunchly pro-EU and pro-European. I think the problem is that it's pretty clear that the centre of political gravity in this country is now moving to a much more Eurosceptic place. I mean, whether everyone who voted for UKIP wants to come out of Europe, I would argue, because they're a protest vote, there's probably quite a significant portion of people who voted UKIP who don't necessarily want to leave the EU. They're just sick of politics the way it's played. But with that political centre of gravity is definitely moving in that direction. And I think that in 5 or 10 years' time, we could actually be out of the EU, which is something maybe 5 or 10 years ago I'd have found pretty difficult to countenance. But I can definitely see that coming.
Richard, could I ask you, the impact of this European election on Tory attitudes towards Europe, what do you think it'll be?
I would have thought it would stiffen their resolve, but with luck, Cameron can pull off that extraordinarily difficult thing, which is to keep the Tories united around a European position, a position of we are in Europe, and Europe is reformable enough to make it worth staying in.
He will have to get lots of assent from other European countries, though. Is that likely to happen?
Well, he's got a better hand to play in that than he's ever had before, and if push comes to shove, we can come out. But I don't think he wants to, and I don't want to, and I think huge numbers of people in this country are persuadable that a recalibrated Europe would be beneficial to us.
And what would that recalibrated Europe look like? Would it just be a free trade zone, basically?
I suppose so, yes. And it would be one that wanted not only to be free trade within itself, but wanted to trade freely with the outside world. So I think that the new position would be Britain as a happy globalizer inside a Europe which was a happy globalizer. And that means a redefinition of Europe's not just its political controls, but its kind of attitude. Whether or not that can be pulled off, I don't know. But we're going to go on being a happy globalizer. That bit looks to me not negotiable over 50 years.
Yeah.
Sonny, for Labour, how is this? Are they going to have to offer a referendum?
Labour is wisely not going to offer a referendum yet. I think what will happen is if they win power in 2015, which I think is likely, they're going to say a couple of years later on that, now we're going to offer a referendum or we're going to set a date. And that will be after the election after that. So it'll be post-2020. So I think that, or they'll say that this will only happen if we significantly renegotiate with Europe, which I think is also likely once the Eurozone stabilizes a lot more. So the Labour Party has pragmatically decided they don't want an internal war over Europe anytime soon. And I think that the Tories, if they win in 2015, which I think is unlikely, is then going to spend 2 years after that having a massive civil war about Europe, and which will weaken Cameron even further. So, either way, they are screwed, and they have shot themselves in the foot by saying that we're going to do this because Cameron is committed, if he wins in 2015, to staying within Europe. And he's going to then have to fight his entire party on the issue and UKIP. So, either way, I think they have shot themselves in the foot, and they're not going to help matters by committing to one.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I'd like very much to thank my guests, Mark Thompson, who's an independent commentator who's joined us down the line and expert on Lib Dem matters, Richard D. North, a Conservative commentator and author of The Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything, and Sunny Hundal, who's a contributor to The Guardian and a political commentator. Thank you all very much indeed. To go, is it realistic to see Clegg going?
Well, that poll was very interesting because that poll was paid for by an anonymous Lib Dem member. And again, I don't recall anything like that having happened in the recent past. And actually what the poll shows is that really, even if Clegg was replaced, even with Cable, it would only make a marginal difference. So I'm not sure that poll has particularly made the case for getting rid of Clegg. I think ultimately it's unlikely Clegg will go because he doesn't want to go. I mean, he looked absolutely exhausted and actually quite emotional in interviews yesterday. But I think when he regroups, I don't think he will go voluntarily. And again, a bit like with Gordon Brown, if Clegg doesn't want to go, it is very, very difficult to get rid of him without there being massive internal bloodshed that would probably leave the party in an even worse position.
Sunny Hundal, speaking of leadership changes, lots of people saying that Miliband is in Scotland and Wales, proving that in European elections at least, that it's become a national party. UKIP's leader, Nigel Farage, now says his party will target a dozen or more seats in next year's general election, hoping to gain influence in what promises to be a tight contest. So where does this week's election leave the established British parties? Will the Lib Dems be forced to turn to a new leader? How will Labour react to losing votes in its heartlands? And can the Conservatives persuade UKIP supporters to turn to them? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Mark Thompson, independent commentator and former Lib Dem, Richard D. North, a Conservative commentator and author of The Right-Wing Guide to Nearly Everything, and Sunny Hundal, political commentator and contributor to The Guardian newspaper. If I might turn to you, Mark, first down the line, the Lib Dems seem to be in all sorts of disarray with lots of talk. You're listening to the Voice of Russia Daily Debate. And today we're discussing the fallout from this weekend's European elections on the three main parties here in Britain. I'm Howell Davis. It's the first time for 100 years that a national election has been won by a party that's not either the Conservatives or Labour. That's the scale of the political earthquake that struck Britain in the last few days. The UK Independence Party won 27.5% of the vote in the European elections, meaning it now has 24 MEPs. Labour, on 25.4%, narrowly beat the Conservatives into third place, while the Liberal Democrats lost all but one of their seats and came fifth behind the Greens. UKIP gained seats not just in traditional Conservative areas, but also in
that are kind of left over, the people who are more likely to be loyal anyway. But I actually think we're now in a position where it's very difficult to call what's going to happen. There's been a petition put together by an organisation called Lib Dems for Change, and they seem to have several hundred signatures, mostly of party members. And there is now talk of local organisations having meetings to talk about the possibility of voting to get rid of Clegg, and there would need to be 75 local parties get together and do that in order to trigger a leadership election. So I think this is definitely the worst situation Clegg has been in, and it actually reminds me, I don't think it's a happy parallel to draw, but it reminds me of the kind of disarray that Labour was in with Gordon Brown in the final year of their time in office.
And do you actually expect Nick Clegg to have to go? I mean, there was a poll in The Guardian today talking about how the party would do better under Vince Cable, but with only a year of defenestrating Nick Clegg.
Absolutely. I think they are in a bit of a mess at the moment, and there seems to be real uncertainty about what's going to happen. it's the first time I can remember there being this level of serious debate about whether Clegg is going to remain leader or not. In some ways, it's been quite remarkable for the first 3 or 4 years of this coalition that there's been so little talk about Clegg going. I mean, you get the usual noises off people like Lord Oakeshott, who would occasionally chip in. Just for the uninitiated, he's a big backer of Vince Cable, and although Vince tends to keep his own powder dry, there are certain outriders. But generally, the membership has been largely happy with what the party leadership has done, albeit there have been quite a lot of members who've left the party, and therefore you could argue that what you've had is the membership, the grassroots